I'm delighted to report that I have joined as a scholar the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom at the University of Mississippi. The center offers educational opportunities, speakers, internship, and reading groups for the University of Mississippi community. It is named in honor of the United States founding document, which constitutes the nation as a political community and expresses fundamental principles of American freedom, including in the recognition of the importance of Judeo-Christian values in shaping American exceptionalism. Dedicated to the academic and open-minded exploration of these principles, the center exists to encourage exploration into the many facets of freedom. It will sponsor a speaker series and an interdisciplinary faculty research team. If you'd like to learn more about the center, please visit OleMiss, that's OLEMISS.edu/independence/. Hi, everybody. This is Saad for the Saad Truth. Today, I have a very special guest, an esteemed historian from Harvard, James Hankins. Jim, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you, God?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. I just want to mention a few things about you beyond that you're a professor of history at Harvard. We're here today, and feel free to put up the book to discuss your mammoth book. I did receive a copy, but it's at my office, The Golden Thread, A History of Western Civilization. Now, you did the first part, and then there is a volume 2 coming, which I'm hoping to have your co-author on the show. Your co-author is, tell me if I'm pronouncing it right, Alan Guelzo.
That's correct.
Okay, perfect. He's a historian at Princeton. You're also a specialist on Renaissance political thinking. Anything else you want to add about your glorious bio before we get going?
Well, I will say that Alan and I have been friends since middle school, since high school, and we've been friends for decades and decades. So this is really a cooperative work. I wrote the first volume and Alan wrote the second volume, but we have largely agreement about its content and direction and so forth. So
now, going to your earliest memories of when you first became friends, was there any inkling that either of you would become historians, or just the serendipity of life led two children friends to both become historians at Ivy League schools?
No, we were both history addicts from very early age. From our early teens, we both loved history. So that's what we talked about throughout our adolescence and our friendship together.
That's amazing. Okay, so let's maybe start first with your own, specialty, which is Renaissance political thinking, and then we can sort of segue into the. I mean, there's so much to talk about in this mammoth book,
Yeah.
but we'll find a way to make it interesting, hopefully, for our viewers and listeners. What led you, out of all possible things that a historian could focus their career on, what led you to this particular topic as the topic of your interest?
Well, I did classics as in high school and also in undergraduate work at Duke. I went to Duke and did Latin Greek there. So I was fascinated by the Renaissance early on, already as an undergraduate, because it was the period when the study of Latin and Greek was at its height. It was the most important cultural activity of that age, because they were trying to have a rebirth of classical civilization. So I guess it was a kind of pride in my subject that led me to the Renaissance, and I had some great teachers. It's the usual reason why people pursue subjects is I had great teachers in that subject. And then when I went to Columbia for graduate school, I worked with a man named Paul Oskar Christeller, who was one of that generation of German Jewish emigres who came over during the Nazizeit, right, in the Hitler period. And he was a professor at Columbia in 1940, and he was still a professor at Columbia when I was there in the 1980s. I kind of attached myself to him. I became his research assistant for 8 years and generally absorbed his love of the Renaissance as well. He was a great lover. Probably the greatest expert on the Renaissance of the 20th century.
Amazing. When I often, well, not often, but I've played the game. If you could invite any 10 historical figures throughout history to your, ultimate dinner party, who would they be? And it may hopefully make you happy to hear that of the 10 people that I would invite, the number one person would be Leonardo da Vinci for several reasons. Number one, well, I mean, I guess they're kind of related because he was the ultimate Renaissance man. He was the true polymath. And I very much lived my academic career contrary to what people tell you should do in academia, which is to be a hyper specialist. I've done exactly the opposite, which is I publish in innumerable fields that many times are completely unrelated, other than in my case, that they have some sort of evolutionary psychology thread in them. So I can publish in medicine or politics or consumer behavior or economics. I don't care about the discipline boundaries. So would you put that guy as your number one guy? If yes, great. Tell us why. If not, who would be your top guy at that dinner
Yeah,
party?
he's definitely up there. And Leonardo was famous for being a great courtier, among other things. He was a very entertaining person. People used to go to his studio he would invite people to his studios. They would be astonished by all the stuff that he's doing. He was a great entertainer or intellectual entertainer. He also played the lute very well and he sang and had all sorts of different skills. So yes, he would be up there at least for the dinner party, I would think. I've never really gotten much outside the field of history and philosophy. I'm really an historian of philosophy, like my teacher. But I can say that I'm not confined to any one historical period, even though up till now, I publish mostly in Renaissance studies. I teach everything. I've taught everything from the Greeks to the modern period at one time or another in my career. I'm now teaching a course in ancient philosophy. I've taught courses on medieval, Renaissance, early modern philosophy. I've taught courses on the history of liberty, going up to Hayek. And so, I don't believe in confining myself to a specialty either.
Oh, beautiful. I actually love Hayek. Last year, I was a visiting professor at Northwood University, and this is a university that's largely a business school in Michigan. And their whole motto, if you'd like, is it's the free enterprise university. So you might imagine that the Austrian economists from the school of the Viennese school are all steeped in freedom. And actually, this current year, I'm a scholar at the uh, Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom at Ole Miss, and hence again freedom. And I did mention to the director of the center that I was going to be speaking with you guys, and he was actually very excited. So I don't know. Do you know anything? Any of the people at Ole Miss?
Not really. No, sorry.
No, no,
I,
that's fine. But,
yeah.
but I mean, I suspect that, you know, the study for American freedom is the culmination of your entire cursus of your book. So why don't we just drill down? How do you decide which parts to include in the book or not include? You're trying to cover 3,000 years of brilliant thinking. Walk us through that process.
Okay, well, decided from the beginning that we weren't going to do a Western Civ book in the normal sense. We were going to do a history of the tradition. So our conception of the tradition is that we have today a fourth order civilization based on the study of Greece, Rome, the Christian Middle Ages, Christendom, and Europe since the 12th century. So we have four civilizations that are connected by this golden thread of tradition. So part of the question, what the principle of choice, I guess, was what is important in the tradition, not necessarily at the present moment, but in modern times, what survived into modern times. So that would be decried as teleological, but in fact, I picture the Western tradition as a tree that's going out from roots and putting off more and more branches. So you can't understand the later traditions without the early ones, beginning with language, right? So that's the principle of selection. But we also felt we needed a narrative. We needed a narrative thread as well. The history of the West can be told as a story, and too often it's not. You know, Western history has been largely replaced in history departments by global history or world history or international history. So that is inimical to narratives. If you're, I have nephews who teach in public schools, and I just hear about the way the history is taught, and it's kind of flipping through different scenes in different periods, and you don't really. It's it's Tibetan monasticism on one page, and it's Hindu religion on the next page. You don't get a sense of the story. So we wanted people to get a sense of the story of the West, and it's very exciting and interesting. One of the things that is exciting and interesting about it is how often it almost died, right? That there's real crises throughout Western history. The Romans just go through crisis after crisis, and very often people thought they were done for. The Gauls conquered them in the 4th century BC, and Hannibal comes close to wiping them out, and then Mithridates comes close to wiping them out, and then their civil wars come close to wiping them out, and they keep coming back. The Romans, they don't give up. They really believe in themselves. They believe that the gods are on their side. So they keep it going for a long time. It's one of the longest lived civilizations in the history of the world. It is maybe, depending on how you figure it, it's the longest lived civilization, because after it gets Christianized in the 4th century AD, it then continues for another 1,000 years, and only really is the Roman Empire only really comes to an end with the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So you can say that the Chinese history of Imperial China is longer, but then you have to assume that all the different dynasties are part of the same empire, which I think is a legitimate way. But it's really China and the West that have the longest lived, largest geographical empires in history.
Inter Interesting. So you were talking about the different times that the Roman Empire was facing existential threats. So let's take that, dark reality and link it to the contemporary West, where one could certainly argue that we are facing some unique threats to our Western civilizations. And if I may say, I've contributed to that dialogue. I'm not sure how familiar you are with my work, but in this book right here, in the yellow book, in the parasitic mind, I basically argue that there are certain parasitic ideas that have infected the minds of, certainly the Western leaders, if not the greater Western populace, that are truly detrimental to our survival. And then in a book that is forthcoming, I then complete that story by arguing that in the same way that our brains can be hijacked, our cognitive processes, our emotional systems can also be hijacked. In this case, I call the book Suicidal Empathy, when empathy misfires in ways that are not evolutionarily optimal. You then end up with the perfect confluence of factors that could bring down a civilization from within. As a historian who has certainly studied how and why previous civilizations either survived or died, what are your thoughts about our current reality in the West? Are we going to get out of the parasitic mind and suicidal empathy, or are we in 500 years we're going to have the next James Hankins talking about the West that no longer exists?
Well, that's the big question. I'm in agreement with you that the civilization is really threatened right now. And what seems to me to threaten it the most is self-hatred. this terrible pall that's hanging over not just the Western civilization, but also in America, over American history, this very negative attitude towards the past, which is ignorant. And if it's not ignorant, it's at least highly selective. And it's maybe I should think of it in terms of a disease because it does seem to appear everywhere in the culture, and it's hard to understand why we should be so negative. And so one reason why we're writing this book, Alan and I, is that we we think that just knowing more about the West will give people a much more balanced view, and that's what will help fight against this black and white thinking and catastrophism and the sense that that the end is nigh, and that our civilization corrupt and should fail. Many people think it should fail. We should replace our civilization with some kind of global civilization. And that's just nonsense as far as I'm concerned. I think the civilizations have to renew themselves. But I will say, you asked at the end the question whether we can renew ourselves. And one good thing about the Western civilizations, plural, is that they do renew themselves. There are many renaissances. I study what we like to call the Renaissance of the 14th, 15th, 16th century. But there have been many renaissances in Western history, starting with, I think, you can go back to the Roman Empire. The first Renaissance was the Romans borrowing from the Greeks. The Romans, one of the great things about the Romans is that they had enough confidence in their military might and the approval of the gods that they could borrow from other civilizations. And that's something that's been a feature of the West throughout its history, is borrowing from other civilizations. But also there's this power of renewal, which you see many, many times. We talk about Theodosian Renaissance in the time of Theodoric in the 5th century AD. We talk about a Justinianic Renaissance in the time of Justinian, and there's a Carolingian Renaissance and the Altonian Renaissance and the 12th century Renaissance and the Italian Renaissance. And so it's a feature of our system that it renews itself. And this, I don't know if you've ever seen this book by Remy Brague. I happen to be working on it right now. It's called Eccentric.
I don't think I know it. No.
Yeah, well, he's a French intellectual called A Theory of Western Civilization. He thinks one of the key distinguishing marks of Western civilization is that it has Renaissance. It has reform, it has Renaissance. The reform is religion reforming itself, and Renaissance is culture renewing itself. So
Interesting.
yeah.
What do you think about, so earlier I was talking about parasitic ideas and so on. Do you see, so in, whether it be in philosophy or literature or actually and even the natural sciences, right? You often hear now sort of the die called diversity, inclusion, equity, where we need to decolonize, and your smile says it all, probably what you think of it. Decolonize and indigenize and so on. Have you, and I hate to say it, I mean, I'm from Cornell, so it's not as though I'm poo-pooing on Harvard. I'm also from the Ivy League. Regrettably, Harvard and many of the other schools have really, taken a big bite out of all that nonsense. So in your long career as a pedagogue, are you seeing the students markedly different from, say, when Alan Bloom wrote, The Closing of the American Mind and so on? Have you seen it in the classroom where you walk in to talk about Epictetus and some intrepid, if not obnoxious student tells you, "Oh, professor, why are we only talking about dead white people? What about the indigenous, whatever?" Do you see that, or have you been inoculated, at least within the ecosystem of your classroom, from all that nonsense?
Well, most of my students are rather conservative type of students, and I teach things like Western intellectual history, so that anything with the word Western in the title will be automatically avoided by anyone who is of the successor ideology. And it's a shame, but because I think that those are the people who really should learn. from it. But what I mostly notice is the very deep ignorance of the students. We have brilliant students, and some of them know a lot. And some of them know a lot about history, usually a very narrow band of history that they may have studied in high school. There's not too many people who have a comprehensive sense of Western history in my classroom. What I miss is being able to refer to or quote Shakespeare, which no one will recognize anymore. They probably have heard of Homer and Plato, but maybe not of more minor figures. They don't. They don't really, I often have to I often lecture on history of Christianity, so I get students saying, "What's the Trinity?" Right, and it just never occurred to me that people wouldn't know what the Trinity was. And the Bible is a complete mystery. Judaism, is hated more than known about. Right, there's a huge anti-Israel sentiment among, it's not so much among the faculty, but among the graduate students, maybe the younger faculty, but it's enough to really, I think, deaden intellectual life because people are afraid to talk about any subject related to that because it's not that they are lacking in courage, it's just that people have only so much bandwidth and you have things to do and you don't really want to spend a lot of time in shouting matches with fanatical students. But one reason I think history is so important is because that history is the antidote to fanaticism.
Right.
It is. And, when we had the COVID lockdowns, which just infuriated me, I have to say, I wrote an article about the COVID pandemic, as I like to call it, and it's compared it to the Black Death and the 6th century plague, which wiped out 40% of the population. And people resented that because they thought I was downplaying the
Right.
dangers
You
of
were not being empathetic.
lacking in empathy. That's right. I didn't care about the people who are dying, and so trying to get any sort of historical perspective on things is suspicious because you might be trying to undermine the sentiments of majority in some way, which is exactly what I was trying to do, get people to be a little more reasonable about COVID restrictions. Harvard wanted us to lecture with masks on. And of course, you've lectured, that this is deadly. You need your face to express all of your emotions, and you can't do it. So I took advantage of the belief that when you drink a glass of water in a restaurant, you can take your mask off. Right? That was allowed. So I brought a bottle of water with me, poured out some glass. I took off my mask and drank a little water, and then the students, of course, realized it was all idiocy. The ones who were concerned could sit a few rows back and put their masks on, but most people, actually, they had to put their masks on, but I thought that was just complete idiocy and lacking any sense of proportion, which is something else that one can learn from history.
Well, not to one up you, but Quebec, where I'm currently, I'm doing this conversation from Montreal. Of all of the draconian states that instituted all sorts of haphazard COVID policies, I dare say that Quebec might have been the worst, the most woke, the most idiotic. So late into the so-called pandemic, we had our government, meaning the Quebec government, the provincial government, institute a curfew whereby you couldn't get out of the house after 8 p.m. So if your dog Fido got diarrhea at 9 p.m. and you had to, now this is in the middle of winter, where it's minus 25, where if you take out your dog Fido for a walk, the likelihood of you running into another human being is very, very small. And it's only because that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, and then they sort of rescinded it. But the fact that they even had the reflex to say after 8 p.m. you can't walk your dog outside speaks to exactly what you're talking about. I wanted to go back quickly to the ancient Greeks. In my last book, I wrote a book on happiness. And of course, it's very, very difficult to talk about the good life and happiness without mentioning the ancient Greeks because they certainly have written a lot about that. And I tell the story in the book of there's a fellow Lebanese author named Nassim Taleb, uh, who I don't know. Do you know who he is? And if you
No,
don't,
I'm sorry, don't.
no, that's fine. Anyways, one time he was teasing me, and he said to me, I don't know what you guys study in psychology, God. Haven't the ancient Greeks already said everything there is to be said about human nature? I mean, he was just ribbing me on me, but as I started doing the deep dive into, Epictetus and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and all the rest who've written about how to live the good life, I started thinking, I think Nassim Taleb might be right here because these guys, I mean, they didn't have the empiricism that we had, right? I mean, they were going on, philosophizing, sort of first principles, logic, reason, and a lot of their insights. So, for example, I remember I had at one point an insight about cognitive behavior therapy and how it could relate to stoicism. Well, Epictetus has already said that, and I'm like, ah, damn, I can't claim that as my own idea. So I've got the historian who could tell us about this. What was in the water that the ancient Greeks were drinking that they were able to be who they were? That's different from all the other periods. I think we can agree. I don't think there's been as great a density of ridiculously bright people as in that period. What was in the magic sauce?
Well, there are these periods in history when there's more cultural flourishing than other times. Renaissance is one, Augustan Rome is another one. In the case of the Greeks, I think it's a society that is egalitarian and it's democratic, and it has a lot to do with it because in a democracy you have to defend your opinions. People get up and have to give speeches, and they have to persuade. In a monarchy, the problem is getting the monarch to be virtuous and care about the people. In a democracy or a republic, also, you have to persuade people because it's a collective governing mechanism. So the alternative to persuasion is violence. And if that's your choice, you learn to persuade. One of the famous historians of science, G.E.R. Lloyd, says that the Greeks didn't have a monarch, so they made reason their monarch.
Nice.
Logic was their monarch, and they agreed to obey reason. And the Romans make law their monarch, right? It's a different system, and that has a lot to do with it. The Greeks developed these sciences of logic which no one had ever developed before. The ancients, going back to the Egyptians and the Babylonians, they all had medicine, but nobody had kind of medical arguments and analysis that Hippocrates of cost invented in the 5th century, that you have to collect all the symptoms, you have to analyze the symptoms, you have to classify them, you have to figure out the etiology, what's the cause of each of these symptoms. Then you name the diseases, and then you come up with the cures, and you test the cures, see which ones work. That kind of experimental empirical approach to medicine is unknown before the 5th century BC Greeks. And you find, in the Babylonians and Egyptians, there's mathematical calculation. They know how to identify, they know when the eclipses are going to come. They have developed calendars and ways of measuring the day. What they don't have is mathematical argument. They don't have proofs from axioms to conclusions. That was invented, by the way, by another man named Hippocrates, but he was Hippocrates of Chios, right? There are two Hippocrates, both did their work in Athens. And so it's somewhat confusing that there are two of them, but they both have this idea that we're not going to look to the gods for explanation. We can do this ourselves, and we have to do it ourselves. And so Hippocrates of Chios develops the first axiomatic system where you can prove conclusions based on a logical progression of ideas from axioms. And that is absolutely key to understanding the Greek mind, this idea of argument. We have to have convincing argument. We have to be able to defeat our opponents. Even in juries, right? In trials, they had 500,000, 2,000 people on the jury. Those people, and they had such large juries because they wanted to avoid bribery. The rich people in Athens could pay off a couple hundred jurors, perhaps, but 2,000 was a tough call. So, but if you're not able to bribe anyone, you're not able to terrorize anybody into following your opinion, you got to persuade them. And I think that is really at the root of this Greek achievement, which then continues. Even when the Greeks turned to monarchy in the period after Alexander the Great, they still have these traditions alive of empirical study.
Can I add another possible mechanism? You tell me how much you think it's true. So you might remember the sociologist Thorstein Veblen,
Oh, yes.
right, the theory of the leisure class, right? And so in order for me to be able to pursue things beyond my immediate survival needs, the society has to have a certain standard that allows me to pursue leisure. Now, not to imply that intellectual pursuits are leisurely, although I would argue that's the highest and most noble form of leisure. Could it also be the case that the society had sufficient, macro riches that it was feasible to have a bunch of thinkers go off in their togas and walk around and think and pontificate? Whereas if you are in the Ethiopian famines, I can't really think about coming up with mathematical syllogisms when I'm worried about where my next meal is coming from. So could that have also contributed to the fact that we have the possibility and the leisure to allow our big thinkers to do nothing but think?
Well, you'll be disappointed to know that Aristotle said the same thing in the opening chapters of
Here, I
Metaphysics.
thought I have another. There you go. He beat me to it.
That's what he says, that we have a
All
certain
right.
now and we can address these issues at a more. He's trying to defend the idea of science for its own sake, right? And he says that all the subordinate sciences are necessary for life, but our science is something that can be done for its own sake, and we can only do it because we're living at a time when people have the leisure. So the Greeks also were wealthy. That's something we have to keep in mind. The Greeks were wealthy, and the wealth went down the social pyramid quite far. So it wasn't just the people at the top. It was the people who were trading and having businesses. The Greeks took advantage of the invention of money, which was done in Lydia by Crises and the Lydians. They created the first international currency, which is the Athenian silver dollar, or it's not a dollar, but I've forgotten the name for it offhand. They develop a kind of primitive economics, a kind of primitive financial system. There's a lot of wealth in Greece, and it's not all at the top. So that's an important consideration, that you have people who can aspire, a middle class that can aspire to a leisured life of the aristocrat. And the other thing I think is very important about the Greeks is that they didn't have professional priesthoods. Right. So if you go to Babylon or Egypt, the intellectual class is coextensive with the priesthood. The people who do science, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, they're all priests. So, and they're trying to uphold a religion, which has, they're not dogmatic religions, but they are religions that respect the gods. So all of their explanations are involved with religious presuppositions, that when you your recipe for a medical cure in Egypt in the third kingdom will be to drink the following mixture and pray to the god. And or maybe if it's really bad, you go to the temple of God and you sleep there and you pray all night. But the religious explanations are mixed up with the what we would regard as rational explanations. So the Greeks did not have professional priests. They had temporary priesthoods, people who had an ordinary life. They were businessmen or they were statesmen or generals. And then a few days every once in a while, they would go and they would fast and they wouldn't have sex for a couple days. And then they could become purified enough to do the priestly rites. And then they went back to normal life. So they didn't have they weren't invested in defending a priesthood and its relationship. They respected the gods. They loved the gods. They were doing their duty, but they didn't think. Their whole thinking mechanism was not theological. In fact, they tried to get away from the superstitions of ordinary people.
You mentioned Aristotle, and then you spoke a bit about religion, and so my mind is very synergistic, as always trying to find bridges to link up different segments of our conversation. Did you ever see, Jim, the movie The Name of the Rose?
Oh, yes.
Oh, so I don't know if you know where I'm going with this. I actually mentioned this in The Parasitic Mind in one of my earlier books. The spoiler alert to anyone who wishes to see the movie. I'm about to spoil the entire storyline. If you remember in the movie, Jim, the monks are falling dead, and there is sort of a black ink on their tongues,
Right.
and they bring in this I don't know if he was Franciscan or Benedictine monk played by Sean Connery to try to resolve this mystery, and it turns out that, do you remember what the punchline is?
No.
You don't remember? Okay. Well, it's going to actually link up to some of this stuff that we're talking about. There was sort of a forbidden library where Aristotle's lost book, I don't know if it's Poetics or
The
it's the one
Poetics book too, yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
and where they talk about humor and so on, and that's viewed as sacrilegious. And so the head monk, who, if you like, has the key to the forbidden knowledge, made sure that if anybody were to get into that library in order to read that forbidden book, he laced the pages where you turn it with the poison so that the monks who read
Yeah.
the
I remember
forbidden
that
book
now.
would be
Yes.
dead. And
Yeah.
I use that story as a perfect example of the grotesque reflex to erect edifices of forbidden knowledge, right? You shouldn't study sex differences because then that will promote antiquated patriarchal theories. Don't study group differences because that might hurt the feelings of marginalized groups and so on, which I
Yeah.
also pick up this theme in suicidal empathy. I call this epistemological empathy. Rather than actually pursuing truth for the sake of truth, you're actually modulating what is true as a function of some grotesque empathy calculus. Uh, so are in through I'm sure it's found throughout the period that you cover in the book, but have there been periods within that sort of 3,000 year chunk where the concept of forbidden knowledge was more likely to be on hyperactive drive than others, or it's just a reflex of human nature? The bosses are always trying to keep the rest of us rubes quiet.
In the same passage of Aristotle's metaphysics I mentioned earlier, he addresses the concern of some of his listeners that to seek knowledge is to challenge the position of the gods. And he has a very elaborate argument for why that is not, that we should try to be like the gods, but we are not gods. That's and he wants to say that there is no piece of knowledge that is denied to us by the gods. But then you have other periods of history where certain types of knowledge are regarded as useless or as a distraction from the more important types of knowledge. The word curiositas in Latin is originally the name of a vice. In Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologiae, he discusses all the virtues and vices, and one of the vices is curiositas, which means that you're getting involved in things you don't need to know. And the word curiositas only changes its valence in the end of the 16th century. It becomes, in the 17th century, really, people decide that curiosity is good for you, it's good for the culture, it's good for the kingdom. So there's that sort of reservation. One of the things that happens that's absolutely vital for the Western tradition, and it distinguishes the Western tradition from the Islamic tradition, is that in the 4th century, there were Christians who wanted to shut down classical culture entirely. They thought it was corrupt, it's evil, that we Christians are better, we have better morality, we're in touch with the one true God, and the classics should be suppressed. They wanted to make the canon to be just the Bible. Bible is enough. We don't need any of these classical poets or encyclopedists or historians or what have you. And they lost. There was a number of Christian thinkers who had been trained in the classics, as it happens, who said, no, we need classical culture. And we need at least to be able to read and write and understand our texts, and we need to know history. We can't really understand. That was the argument. We can't understand the Bible without the pagan grammatical and rhetorical sciences and so forth. And so, but that the foot was in the door, so that later on, during the in the Latin West. During the early Middle Ages, the monks would study classical antiquity. So every single work of classical antiquity we have written in Latin at some point was copied by a monk. And so, it's one thing to have an official doctrine, and St. Augustine had a very elaborate explanation for what you should study and what you can't study. Eventually people ignore it and do what they want. They follow their interests. So I have a nephew who teaches in the public schools, and he tells me that, yes, we do get ukases from the State Department of Education that tells us what we should be teaching and tries to enforce all of their political agendas, but people can ignore them. They don't have to teach what the state tells them. And as long as nobody complains, no one cares. The principals don't want to rock the boat, and even the DEI people are not really. They don't know enough really to see us, to oversee what we're doing. So there's one thing is official doctrine, and there's another thing to what people actually do.
Gotcha. And so you've been a professor now 4 decades, roughly. Does that sound right? Is that
40
right?
years, yeah.
40 years. If I were to ask you, what has been your biggest disappointment as an academic of 4 decades, what would it be? And in a sense, I'm asking you the question because I have a answer myself to that question, which I'd like to share with you. But let's hear your answer first, and I'll give you mine after.
Well, what I miss the most is the desire to be excellent, the desire for the best people. So when I got to Harvard, I came to Harvard from Columbia. It was my first job after graduate school. And Columbia is a very good university. It has many distinguished faculty, but I didn't ever pick up the vibe, which I got immediately at Harvard, that we have to be the best. We every appointment that we make, we're going to go through the top 10 people in the world and start at number 1 and go down to number 10. But we're not going to even go down to number 10. If we don't get 1, 2, and 3, forget it. We'll have a different search. There was this great sense that and you can say it's arrogance, and of course Harvard is an arrogant place. But on the other hand, it was at one time it was, I think, justified arrogance because they did make a real effort to hire the best people. And the president of the university, Derek Bach, was, had a brain trust to search the world of academe for the best people. And if the departments weren't interested in hiring those best people, well, he'd go do it. You know, Peter Brown, who is this very great ancient historian, uh, used to joke he couldn't come. He didn't want to accept a lecture invitation from Harvard because he'd have to listen to the hiring spiel from Derek Bach, right? But we lost that at some point. We in the 1990s we had a new idea of what a good history department looked like, and it would have so many women, so many minorities.
Transgender.
Oh, we don't get transgender. I don't know if anyone's ever. Well, there's one transgender graduate student now, but that was never transgenderism never came into it. Um, but there's now this overlay of concern with having. Bill Clinton used to say he wanted to have a cabinet that looked like America, and that's what my colleagues want. They want a history department that looks like America, that has all the minorities in the correct proportions, and that ended up trumping all the desire for outstanding colleagues.
Indeed.
So yeah, so that's and that the standards for hiring were lowered because we had to have so many of each kind.
Well, if I may share, well, two personal stories about Harvard. First one, very, very much personal. The second one, less so. I came close to getting my first professorship at Harvard Business School, which is not an easy job to get. It was down to a few people. I was invited. I went through the rounds and I got to the final round, which is a campus visit.
Yeah.
I delivered a lecture, and this is 1993. And I heard through inside sources that I ended up not getting that job because I don't ovulate. So it turns out that even in 1993, you were already walking away from the meritocratic ethos. Imagine how much more glorious Harvard would have been had you had me as a professor for the past 32 years. The second story I was going to say, one of my personal intellectual heroes is actually a Harvard colleague of yours, and I'm so excited to find out if you've actually ever met him. He passed away now. E.O. Wilson from the biology department. Do you have any E.O. Wilson stories to share?
No, I didn't know him, sorry, but I know about his work. He's a very famous colleague, yes.
Yeah, I mean, even from a historical perspective, as a historian, he had a lot to say about how you apply sociobiology to human affairs, which, oh my God, that was so controversial. Who would have thought that humans are driven by biological forces? Oh my God, he must have been a Nazi. But in any case, he talked about even sociopolitical systems. Maybe my viewers are going to be tired of me quoting the ensuing quote, but when he was famously asked what he thought about communism and slash socialism, he studied as his professional field, he studied social ants. And in social ants, they are communistic. There is a reproductive queen, and then there is an indistinguishable mass of worker ants and warrior ants. And so when he was asked, what do you think about socialism, communism? The greatest pithy answer of all time: great idea, wrong species, which basically, there you go. I finally got Jim to crack up. So in those few words, I mean, that's a mic drop moment, right? If you build socio-political economic systems that are incongruent with human nature, you don't have to run the study. It's going to fail. Now, we ran it for the past 100 years. It has failed everywhere it's been tried. But you know what? Maybe Ocasio-Cortez will try it better. Maybe Mamdani will try it. And now this time around will be super successful. So yeah, exactly. But is there a way from your perspective to take a lot of the principles that I spend my time thinking about, evolutionary principles, how they affect human nature, and incorporate them within an accurate study of historical patterns?
Well, I've been very taken recently with Ian McGilchrist's model of left hemispheric and right hemispheric brain and his application of that to periods of human history. I'm not sure his history is as fine-grained enough as it needs to be. And I would like to explore actually reconstructing intellectual history along McGill-Christian lines. Uh,
Interesting.
at a much lower level of intellectual achievement, I've often found the idea behind Dawkins's memes,
Yes.
and I understand that memes are not really his sense of meme, not the journalistic sense of meme, but I've often found that the idea of a recessive gene and a dominant gene or meme works in intellectual history because you have these stored ideas that are in the tradition, and at certain points they come out. The environment is such that a belief in popular government comes out. So, for example, after the fall of the Roman Republic, the Republic is essentially dead by the end of the first century AD, and there is no more Republican government for 1,000 years. And then suddenly, in the late 11th, early 12th century, republics start appearing again. It's a complex process, but no one's had a republic for 1,000 years. And suddenly the Italians of northern Italy are having, senates, they have two consuls, they have the magistrates with all the same names as the Roman magistrates, they have assemblies. It looks like the Roman Republic. So where does that come from? Well, it's a recessive meme, I call a recessive meme of republicanism, which has been preserved in a few texts in Livy and in Cicero and Sallust, and people kept reading those. They were there present in the tradition, and at a certain point, they suddenly made sense. Oh, this is the way we should organize our political system.
Oh, I've never.
I'm
Sorry, go
not.
ahead.
Sorry, you tell me whether I've understood. I'm not anything close to a biologist, but I understand that Dawkins's idea of memes is not accepted by.
Well, I love your incorporation of sort of the recessive versus dominant genes to intellectual thought. I've certainly seen Darwinian approaches to the study of how ideas proliferate, but not necessarily using the terminology of recessive versus dominant. So I like that. By the way, you may or may not know this, Jim, but there's a field called evolutionary epistemology, and Donald Campbell would be a classic example. It specifically applies the Darwinian process of selection to ideas. And here the idea being that in the same way that the currency of evolution is that there is a random mutation which arises out of the combination of genes through sex. And if that random mutation confers a reproductive or mating advantage to the animal that has that random mutation, then there are selection pressures for that mutation to be retained, and then eventually it becomes part of the phenotype of the species. Well, ideas are akin to a random mutation, right? And so, whatever the example that you mentioned in northern Italy, something led to the fact that there was a kind of a rebirth or a repackaging or a new arising of this idea, and then there are selection pressures to select it. So if this is a general ecosystem that you're interested in, I would implore you to look at the work in evolutionary epistemology. It'd be right in line with what you're talking about.
Hmm. That's interesting. I should look at that. Are you aware of McGilchrist's work on the?
I'm not. As you mentioned it, I was about to take a note because I've never heard of it. So maybe you could text me or email me the stuff because I'd love to delve
Yeah,
into it.
I think you would love it actually. And the main book that I'm working on with is called The Master and His Emissary, about the relationship between left hemispheric thought and right hemispheric thought. He's a doctor, a medical doctor, and a clinician, and someone also who's deeply involved in the science of the mind. So he speaks from a place of authority. He's not a philosopher
Right.
like most philosophers who don't have an expertise in science.
So you're collaborating with him on this
No,
project?
no, no. That would be a dream, actually. But I have been trying. I have a little correspondence with him, but I need a little more time off to get into that in any serious way.
Got you. Okay, a couple of more questions. I want to be mindful of your time. Uh, so you, of course, right now we're trying to promote your book. Let me mention it again. The Golden Thread: A History of the Western Tradition. Volume 1 is by Jim. Volume 2 coming out, I think, in December 2025, correct? Does that sound right?
That's great.
By Alan Guelzo. Other than this mammoth undertaking that you were courageous enough to tackle, are there any projects in the short-term pipeline that we should expect from Jim Hankins?
Well, we're going to spend a lot of time promoting this book, and we hope that we will. It's not just a book that we wrote. We're trying really to found a new Western Civ tradition in mostly classical schools, homeschoolers. We don't expect the public schools that are run by teachers unions to pick it up, but there are so many people now leaving the public schools. I think it used to be 95% of people went to public schools in America because they were free up until about 10, 12 years ago. And now it's more like 83%. There's so many people who have pulled out of public schools. So the book is really for them because we think that that's where we're going to be able to refound Western Civ. The next project actually I'm working on is international relations project about it will sound idealistic and silly, but it's about a virtue-based uh, international relations theory. And it grows out of another book that I wrote in 2019, which is called Virtue Politics.
Ah, nice.
Um, and that this talked about the attempt of the Italian humanists of the Renaissance to reform politics by reforming the educational system and creating a state that would promote merit over heredity. So I'm trying to apply virtue politics to a global theory of civilizational interaction. I'm against certain types of globalism, but I think that civilization-based global relations that get into competition in virtue and competition in cultural achievements, that is the way to try to create a harmonious international relations system. And it doesn't sound very convincing, I know, because most people are instinctively Machiavellian.
Ah,
So when it comes to international relations, but I'm trying to make the argument against the Machiavellian impulses of IR to say that there are the motives for cooperation and for noble rivalry. That's a Renaissance term. Noble rivalry is what should be encouraged.
well, when you finish that book, please come back and let's discuss it, and let's get your collaborator on this two-volume series to come on the Sad Truth. I look forward to that. What a pleasure it was to talk to you. Please stay on the line for us to say goodbye offline. And best of luck with this incredible project that you're working on. Can you put it up again for us so that people can hopefully get out and buy this?
It's strong enough. It's 7 pounds. Here it is.
The Golden Thread, A History of the Western Tradition. Thank you so much, Jim. Please stay on the line. Take care.
Thank you.